To see the problems in all of these places. And the one that we saw first was worship, because Janet said on the way home from church one Sunday, I can't go listen to that man preach anymore and call it worship. Something's missing, but I don't know what it is. You all know what it was. What was missing? Sacrifice. The holy sacrifice of the Mass, the Eucharist at the hands of the priest. Every human being that has had a religion in all of time, all people, when they came to the God or the gods or whatever they perceived the deity to be, they never came empty-handed. They always came with an offering or a sacrifice. Even the Jews had sacrifices. All the religions have sacrifices. You know about that here in India. And our church did not have a sacrifice. We just had preaching. So when I began to think about it, and by the way, that Janet started our whole journey into the Catholic Church. It wasn't me. Janet started it. And when her father got angry at me and he said, you took my daughter out of the Presbyterian church into that cult, I said, I didn't start it. It was the woman you gave me. So we started thinking about what worship was. And I realized that about worship, there has to be an offering or a sacrifice. It doesn't just mean adding 5 new guitars. These churches out there do not have the sacrifice. They do not have the blessed sacrifice of the Mass. The earliest Christians from the first century had an altar. They had the Mass. And I have now, since becoming a Catholic, my wife and I have been to every single one of the oldest churches in the world. You couldn't build churches before 300 AD because it was illegal, but once Emperor Constantine legalized it in 313, people started building churches. And I have been to every single one of the first churches, whether it's in Israel or Egypt or Italy or Syria, anyone. I've been to all of them. And I can tell you for a fact that every single one of them had one thing in common. Some were circular churches, some were square, made of stone, made of brick, made of wood. But every church had one thing in common, and that is in the front, in the center, they had an altar. And in front of the altar was a priest. Right from the first century. You go back and read the first writings of Christianity, there was always an altar. And what is an altar? The technical definition of the word altar is a place of sacrifice. In the Old Testament, an altar is where you killed an animal and blood came off the altar. An altar is a place of sacrifice, and every single church in the first 1,500 years had an altar, and in front of the altar was a priest. And then a guy named Martin Luther came along, and his buddies Zwingli and Bucer and Melanchthon and a bunch of others, and they said, we don't need the Pope, and they threw the Pope away, and we don't need the tradition, and they threw the tradition away, and the next thing most of them went after was the altars, and they removed the altars from the front of the church, and what did they put in their place? In their place, they put a podium, a lectern, and it was now a different religion. Real Christianity from the beginning had an altar with a priest. My church only had a podium with a preacher, and it was a different religion. And eventually Janet and I said, why is our church today different than all the churches was all the way back to the apostles? Number one reason that opened our eyes to the Catholic Church.